Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today, Training Your Maintenance Staff, 5 Key Areas to Focus on in 2020. I just want to remind everyone that this webcast is not eligible to go towards continuing education credit. I want to introduce our host today. His name is Bruce Cole. So throughout a diversified career spanning 4 decades, Bruce has held positions ranging from senior maintenance technician to plant manager and engineering vice president. He holds a few impressive credentials. He's a certified facilities manager, a certified energy manager, and an associate in applied science and electronics technology. He also specializes in the areas of tool and die, hydraulics and pneumatics, injection molding, and nuclear energy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our host and presenter, Bruce.
Thank you, Carol. Well, welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. What we're going to talk about today is the five key areas that are related to making your building a better, safer place. Now, you may say, well, some of these areas we're going to discuss are fairly obvious, but the fact is attention to them can really improve the operation and the safety, which we're all concerned with, of our individual buildings or whatever our responsibility may be. So going back to the beginning here, kind of fundamentally, our society has really dramatically changed over the past few years. Manufacturing and other services were typically performed strictly by manual labor at one time. And today, of course, we have a number of automated machines and robots and computer operations that perform those what we call boring and repetitive tasks. And while we have gained technologically, and we've also gained some productivity, quality, and certainly consistency, we really also have lost something. In the transition to automation, our mindsets have really changed. Many people today, and particularly younger generations, believe that computers can and will be able to do everything. And it's simply not true. That, no matter what the task, that these computerized systems can outperform humans and basically be better, free humans up to do, more leisurely type activities. And again, someday that perception may become reality, but for now, there still exists a large majority of tasks that require human intervention and the human thought process that simply cannot be accomplished by computers. So what we're going to talk about today is the 5 critical areas of building maintenance that are going to help keep your staff, your tenants, and your visitors simply more safe, and also will maintain the very heavy investments that you have in your buildings where they should be so that you're not deteriorating. So humans provide these services today, these analyses and corrections and that sort of thing. Now, again, you're going to say when we go through these that these are very obvious areas, but the fact is that the lack of attention to the items that we're going to talk about today actually cause more than 5,000 accidents a year, according to OSHA. And some of these accidents are pretty severe. They can cripple people. They can be permanent injuries, and some are actually fatalities. So if you're a building supervisor or manager, or perhaps even a maintenance person, attention to the items I'm going to discuss will minimize the potential for accidents. And that really should be what we all want and strive for, a safer environment for the folks that are under our care, basically visitors, tenants, and employees. So I hope you see the value in establishing these 5 items I'm going to talk to you about today as priorities in your building maintenance efforts. Now, I don't want to fool you into thinking that we're going to go into great detail on all of these items. We simply don't have the time. But we are going to look at 5 building maintenance priorities, and I'm going to just touch on them. But the fact is, Vector Solutions has much more in-depth training available on each of these items as we go through them. So again, I'm going to just touch on them, sort of skim the surface, if you will. But the fact is, more detailed training, much more in-depth training is available. And if you contact a Vector Solutions representative, they would be very happy to talk to you about specific training for your facility and how you can take advantage of it. So, again, right now, these building areas that I'm going to speak to, only humans can provide the particular talents required to look at these items. And one of the common themes you're going to hear throughout the entire presentation today are the three most important things, if you will, from the standpoint of maintenance, and that is inspection, correction, and documentation. You're going to hear me repeat those several times. So those are things which are truly important as we address each of these particular areas. So again, we don't want to get into a situation where we're putting our tenants, our employees, or our visitors at risk. That's why we're going to look at each one of these from the standpoint of maintaining safety and making sure that we've done the best we can to keep our folks from having accidents or injuries. Now, I want to talk first about overall building integrity. Now, all of our modern buildings, whether we've got a 30-story high-rise that we're responsible for, or just a single-story apartment complex, these things all require frequent assessments of their integrity. And I'm talking here specifically structural integrity. Integrity means everything that is in place and fully functional as the designers and the builders originally intended. Now, this integrity definition obviously breaks down into multiple subcategories, and we're going to look at three of those specifically. There are more, and certainly there are more than the 5 main headers that I'm talking about in this presentation. But these are kind of the big hitters, if you will, the things that can really make a difference. So again, I ask that you please pay attention because, hey, again, we're talking safety. We don't want to compromise that in any way, shape, or form. So first of all, building integrity, we're looking at the building structure. Now, whether a structure is held together by welds or bolts or screws or nails, it has to be thoroughly inspected on a regular basis because all of those things, welds, bolts, screws, or nails, they fail over time. So we need to make sure that we are well aware of either something which has failed or something which is headed toward failure. So we're looking for deficiencies, actual failures, weakened structural members, and of course the point of attachments. Screws loosen up, bolts loosen up, things of that nature. So if you look at something from the outside, they can look like they're in pretty good shape. But the fact is, unless you look at what really makes it up, how it's really put together, you can be fooled. And I don't care how capable or how many years you've had at it. The fact is that unless you really get kind of intimate with your structure, you're really not going to understand the state of the structure. So a structure that looks good and solid, doesn't necessarily mean that it is. About 20 years ago, of course, you remember that there were bridges that collapsed in this country that, again, came under scrutiny after these collapses. They were neglected. That was the simple reason for their failures. They were neglected for many years, and only when those bridges started collapsing did the authorities begin to treat the inspection and the maintenance of bridges more seriously. And the same lesson needs to be applied to any structure, but particularly buildings that people work or congregate in. All structures, whether held together again by the welds, bolts, screws, or the nails, have to be thoroughly inspected on a regular basis for particularly weakened structural members, but also for complete failures and all the point of attachments. Any deficiencies have to be corrected as soon as possible. So again, there's that correction, inspection and correction. I didn't mention their documentation, but that's extremely important as well. Then we want to talk a little bit about roofs in the building. Now, I personally have had a lot of experience with roofs over the course of my career, and I can tell you that no single component of a building can cause so much grief as a defective roof. They have to be inspected, I say annually on the slide, but the fact is more frequent inspection is really better. Leaks, which are very, very easy to have in a roof, can lead to water damage inside. And of course, you get water inside, moisture, even if it gets dried out, the fact is if it sneaks into a wall or between the roof members, you can end up with mold growth. Mold requires three things to grow. It requires some kind of organic material for it to feed on, and it requires moisture, and it requires warmth. And unfortunately, that's what we have pretty much everywhere in buildings today. So it can be very hard to eradicate too once it gets in there. And of course, there's a lot of attention being put on mold nowadays from the standpoint of poisons and that sort of things in the air. So we want to be very careful about whether we allow it to grow or not. I would say not. You can do infrared aerial scans of roofs, which will show water infiltration and help pinpoint areas where leaks are originating from, but they're no substitute for regular inspections, physical inspections done right at the point of the roof itself. So again, you're looking at potentially a lot of damage, a lot of mold growth. You can ruin furniture, you can ruin walls and structurals and that sort of thing if you allow water infiltration. So it's a good thing to maintain your roof in really good shape. Technology, again, has advanced to the point where these scans can be made, but they're no substitute for going and actually seeing yourself. And when I say yourself, again, if you're a building manager, you would typically send your technicians to do it and that sort of thing. But it doesn't hurt to know a little bit more about your own building as well. So it wouldn't hurt you to go and have a look too occasionally. So we want to look here too about systems integration. Now, this is kind of a wide subject, but there are items that are as simple as doors or windows, or perhaps as complex as elevators and other support systems, fire suppression systems, and that sort of things that are all part of systems that are integrated together within a building. And when any one or more of these systems fail, well, then the entire building environment becomes susceptible to these health and safety issues that I talked about earlier. Some of these items, again, very simple. You may say, oh, that's no problem. We'll just throw a little caulking on it. Well, you need to put the caulking in place if it's failed for a reason. Either the design wasn't quite up to par to begin with, or the material that was used wasn't quite what it should have been. But again, you need to inspect to be able to determine what you need to do in order to correct the issues. Moving on to the second item, we want to talk about life safety concerns. And again, I don't mean to minimize the building integrity issues, but because of time, I can't just get into everything that's involved here. So please bear with me as we touch on these subjects from a very, very high level, and understand that more in-depth training is available if that's what you seek. We can always replace building components, speaking to life safety concerns. But the fact is, we cannot replace people. And that's why life safety is taken so seriously. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the National Fire Protection Association, they address life safety specifically in several documents, and most notably in NFPA 101, which is simply devoted to life safety concerns in buildings. The bottom line is that life safety is not ever to be taken lightly. And quite honestly, there are a lot of laws written about it, to make sure that everybody does things the way they should do them to protect life and limb. But the fact is, it goes well beyond that. It is also a moral obligation that we have to our fellow man to make sure that whatever we have control of, it's the safest possible for anyone else to be there. So one of the things regarding life safety concerns is having unobstructed building egress. When I say building egress, obviously, this is the ability to be able to get out of a building if there's some kind of an issue, whether it be a severe storm that's coming along, or whether it be a fire that's coming along, or anything along those lines which presents some kind of hazard to personnel. And we're talking here specifically about unobstructed building exits. And of course, they're only one aspect of building egress. Within the buildings, again, we're not just talking about outside exits here, we're talking about within the buildings. We also have to have pathways to the outside exits that are kept clear. I can't tell you how many times I have seen trash cans or other obstructions placed in the way of internal doors so that they couldn't fully open. And that's illegal, quite honestly, in a public building. So please be wary of those sorts of things. Make sure that all of the building egress from wherever point inside the building to completely outside the building is completely unobstructed, so that people can pass through doorways as they have to get out. And also remember, it's not always going to be the case where everything is brightly lit and you have basically a very clear indication of where you should go. The building could be darkened because of power loss. It could be darkened because there's smoke everywhere. People might have to get down on the floor literally and crawl. So we want to make sure that the building egress is completely free of obstructions at all times. And again, it's more than common sense. It is the law. Moving on to sprinkler and fire control systems. All public buildings require an approved fire suppression system. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to everyone. Now, depending on the water source pressure and volume that may be available, you might also have to install a water storage tank and possibly a diesel-powered fire pump at your facility. This is not to take the place of the sprinkler or anything like that. It is to supplement it. Just understand that fire pumps and tanks are supplements. They are not something which is going to exclude the need for connection to an outside water source and prevent the need for sprinklers or anything like that. But of course, there are additional systems, and as such, we need to make sure that they work. So they have to be exercised according to a schedule, and usually depending on the authority having jurisdiction in your area, it's usually monthly that they have to be exercised. Now, it doesn't mean you turn your sprinklers on. What you do, you have the pump run in place, and basically you have it recirculating, and you check the pressures and all that good stuff. But you make sure that it comes on automatically as it's supposed to when the sprinkler system basically discharges. And again, as I said earlier, inspection, correction, and documentation. When the testing takes place, you have to make sure you carefully log and document all the results so that A, the authority having jurisdiction realizes you performed the test, and B, that everything did operate properly. And if it didn't operate properly, that you've scheduled it for a corrective action, and it should be quick. Some of the deficiencies that you run into most frequently with these type of systems are the batteries are low and they wouldn't start the diesel-powered pump. And sometimes there are low levels of fuel because obviously diesel-powered pump requires diesel fuel. And sometimes the fuel sits there for such a long period of time and it doesn't have stabilizer in it, so it tends to get gummy or dirty. So these are things, again, which are easily corrected, but you have to inspect them in order to make sure that you understand what needs to be done. So a couple of things to just remember about fire safety control systems. They are not designed to extinguish a fire. You know, sometimes I've been in buildings sometimes when the fire alarm has gone off and people just sit there. I mean, that's not what you're supposed to do. If the alarm goes off, you're supposed to get out of the building as quickly as possible, because these systems are not intended to extinguish the fire. They are only designed to suppress a fire long enough so that the people in the area can evacuate. And again, don't stay somewhere. If an alarm goes off, move. All right, get out, because that's what the alarm is telling you to do. Again, this is a life safety issue, and people many times just don't seem to understand it. So please train your people so that they do understand it. The important thing here to take away is that these systems must be regularly inspected and maintained. And in addition to the fire pump, you also have things like flow switches, backflow preventers, diaphragm switches, air compressors. If you have a dry system, basically you have air in that system, and your water is blocked from coming into the sprinklers by virtue of air pressure. But if you have a sprinkler go off because it's gotten too hot, well, then the air immediately evacuates, allowing the water to flood the system, and then the water comes through the system. So you have to have an air compressor to do that. These are just little things typically, but again, they need to be maintained. And then, of course, you also have pressure gauges and valves and all the system that makes up a complete sprinkler and fire control system. So they all need to be regularly maintained so that there's no question that when an actual emergency occurs, they'll function properly. And unfortunately, it's not a case of if a real emergency is going to occur, it's a case of when. Then we also have emergency alarms, and these are typically tied into your sprinkler or fire control system. And there are all kinds of alarms. You can see a couple of examples there on the slide. These are relatively simple systems. Again, getting back to my initial introduction here regarding computer control systems. Yes, these are computer control systems, and right now these do a job far better than a human would because they can monitor multiple points and be able to have the entire system go into an alarm condition very quickly, alert the people and get them out of the building, or at least tell them to get out of the building. So these systems are superior to what a human can do at the moment. And as a building manager, as the slide says, you're responsible to assure all these alarms are operational when they need to be. That means they have to be tested. And many buildings also have alarms for other things, other types of emergencies, such as excess carbon monoxide or low oxygen, or perhaps like a tornado warning or some other kind of severe weather warning. Well, these things, again, are intended to prevent life-threatening conditions, or at least minimize them. So you're responsible to assure that all of these alarms are always operational. And in the case of multiple alarms, that the occupants of the building know what each alarm signifies. I mean, you don't want to send people running outside if there's a tornado on the way in. You send them to a shelter, whether it's inside the building or at some subterranean location close by. But again, they won't know that unless they know what the different alarms mean. So if they're not confined to just audible horns or sirens, then there will also be strobe lights, flashing lights. And this is typical with your fire alarm systems. These alarms, again, must be tested, and the auxiliary alarm panels must be assured to be working on a regular basis. And again, the authority having jurisdiction is going to want to know this, whether it's a fire marshal or whoever else it happens to be. So again, the inspection, correction, and documentation must be done regularly on each of these systems. Then there's also emergency lighting. And this is also part of a life safety concern. All emergency lights, again, have to be tested periodically to make sure that a battery can provide a sufficient charge to keep the light lit for a minimum of 20 minutes. Now, these are these things that are typically on the wall. Looks like a little box and might have one or two little things that look like car headlights on them. And when the power goes out, the lights come on typically. And it's also true if there's some kind of an emergency, the lights will typically come on, intended to give you at least enough light so you can see to get out of the building or out of that area. But again, I cannot tell you how many of these systems over the course of my career I have tested, and they didn't last for 20 minutes. Matter of fact, some of them didn't last for 20 seconds. So these are one of these areas which are kind of neglected. They need to be tested periodically, at least annually, and more frequently is better, to make sure that the batteries are indeed sufficient to be able to keep the lights lit for 20 minutes, minimum 20 minutes. And then again, these tests must be documented and available for the local authority having jurisdiction to review on a regular basis. And all of the emergency lights within any given structure need to be tested, again, at that same frequency. And then one other thing regarding life safety concerns is building security. And this would include things like guards and surveillance cameras and sign-in stations and perhaps x-ray scanners. Unfortunately, over the last few years, we've had a real uptick in violence, workplace violence. And while most of it is perpetrated by folks who either know someone or knew someone who worked at the site or former employees of a particular site, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be some other kind of perpetrator coming in. For example, the school shootings we've had, these are people typically from outside that perhaps have no connection to the school at all. They just want to make some kind of socio-political statement. Well, that's well and good on their part. The problem is it puts everybody at risk in that area. These people are not stable from a emotional standpoint and therefore unpredictable. So hard to reason with folks like that. The best we can do is protect physically against such sorts of attacks. So again, what we want to do here is to make sure that we protect our employees, our visitors, and of course our tenants, depending on where we are, what we're doing, and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of ways to get there from here, but I've talked about a couple. Basically, surveillance cameras certainly work as far as a deterrent. It's not going to stop somebody from doing something, but if they see that they're being recorded, they're much less likely to go ahead and continue with what they're doing. Or if, for example, none of these preventive measures work, then certainly you need to do something. You need to be prepared yourself, and you need to prepare the folks that you have responsibility for to run away from the problem, hide from the problem, and fight only as a last resort if there's the opportunity for that at all. Again, I don't advocate running, hiding, and fighting. I advocate preventing. So make sure that to the extent we can, we have whatever preventive measures in place that are reasonable, logical, and can help the safety of the folks that you have charge of. All right, moving on to the next topic, I want to talk a little bit about personnel and product temperature and humidity control. Now, buildings today, almost all of them, those that are intended for human occupancy, have air conditioning. And the air conditioning is produced one of several different means. And if you don't have a working or reliable building temperature and humidity control, then most of the building occupants, if you are in a tenant-controlled building, then they're going to be pretty dissatisfied. If we want people to remain safe and comfortable in our buildings, then we need to be thorough in maintaining the temperature and humidity control systems. So I want to talk first about personnel and product temperature and humidity control regarding HVAC systems. Now, HVAC systems, heating, ventilating, air conditioning systems, they are here to stay. They are part of our lives, ubiquitous, as you might say. They need to be maintained, though, and this involves several different aspects. First of all, we want to make sure that they circulate and exchange clean air. We don't want to throw dirty air or air which is contaminated back into an area. Again, the requirements from the folks that make, set these requirements up are for at least 3 and possibly as many 5 air changes an hour in a given area. And that doesn't mean you're throwing dirty air back in or you're just recirculating the air that's within a structure. You're bringing in clean air from outside. You also want to remove the heat and the latent moisture that's in the air. When I say latent moisture, we're talking about humidity, obviously, that has a certain temperature to it. It can make you feel very uncomfortable. Even if you're in an air-conditioned building, that has a high moisture level, you'll still feel pretty sticky. I know that. I'm in the South. The South gets pretty sticky. Well, you don't want to be that way if you're in a building. You want it to be air conditioned and you want to feel comfortable. And in some cases, of course, if you're up in the north, you're going to be adding heat and or moisture back into the air simply because uh, in the north where it gets cool, the moisture is lower and also the heat is low. So you want to make sure that if you want to maintain comfort, you're in that 70 to 73 degree range, and also humidity somewhere between 50 and 65%, give or take. So there are numerous aspects to air conditioning systems that help to assure that all these things happen. But I want to make sure that everybody realizes that air conditioning systems, although they seem relatively simple, and they are for the most part simple systems, um, they are the things that can cause the greatest disagreements between tenants and landlords above everything else. And there are a couple of different types that have been out there, and again, I don't know what type you're going to be faced with in your particular building, but leave it to the pros. All right, call in the experts. If you have HVAC certified or trained people on staff, that's great. Make sure that they keep their certifications up. Make sure that they fully understand everything that needs to be done in order to maintain the safety and comfort of the people that are under their care. And we want to make sure that the the systems, if you will, perform not necessarily at peak all the time, but they perform well enough to be able to keep the building in a comfortable and relatively dry, or at least non-mold growing state for as long as possible. Because again, that is what our tenants expect, what our visitors expect. Now, there are also in buildings, particularly warehouse type buildings, there are refrigerated spaces. And there are a lot of different components within a refrigeration system, not unlike an air conditioning system, that can contribute to failures or degradation of some form or other. You have compressors, and these can be either closed hermetic compressors or open valve access compressors. You can have coils. You have both an evaporator coil and a condensing coil, fans to circulate the air over the various coils, and you have expansion valves or capillary tubes, which allow the refrigerant to move through the system. Well, success in these systems is making sure that all those components are operating properly and that they're matched to one another. These systems, these refrigerator systems, sometimes can be even more urgent to keep under control, if you will, or make sure that they operate properly than even the human cooling systems, because there's many times products which cannot be recovered if they're allowed to go above a certain temperature. Um, I know I worked years ago for a company that manufactured these type systems to use in the biomedical industry. If you have certain biomedical products that have to be kept at near freezing, not below freezing, but near freezing, if they're allowed to go above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, then whatever it is could be ruined. And some of these things are very, very expensive. So you don't want to be responsible for a situation like that where a failure which could have been prevented occurs, and thousands or perhaps even millions of dollars worth of product is lost. So therefore, attention to the detail regarding the maintenance of refrigerated spaces is extremely important. And again, all of these components I mentioned either contribute to success or failure when maintaining a refrigerated space. And then one thing which is not really talked about a whole lot, I did mention it a few moments ago, regarding humidity control and condensation. Part of an air conditioner's job is to first dry the air, get some of the humidity out if there is excess humidity. And what that does is produce what we call condensate. You're basically condensing out the water that's in the air into water droplets, which normally are collected in pans and then pumped out to some kind of collection point or into a drain. And of course, some of these systems are more complicated. They have float switches and piping and that sort of thing. Well, spilled condensate, if condensate gets away from you, so to speak, it can cause damage to ceilings. It can cause damage to furniture. It can be the same as a roof leak, or perhaps even worse, because it too can promote mold growth. Sometimes you'll have air conditioning systems where these condensate recovery systems are pretty hard to get to. So they do require a little bit of extra effort to inspect them, but the inspection is extremely important. And taking preventive measures is always best rather than taking corrective measures, which are after the fact. Um, Again, I'm talking on a very high level here, so I can't get into all the theories and physics of heating and cooling and all that. But again, talk to Vector Learning if you need to know something more about that. And there are a lot of different classes that we have, courses that will accommodate your course needs, no matter what they are. Anyway, water vapor is all around us all the time, which is a good thing, by the way. But it can be a little annoying because if there's excess moisture, it makes us, like I said, feel sticky. So we don't want to do that. We want to get some of that moisture out of the air down to a certain level. Well, that condensate goes into our air conditioning systems and goes into this drain that I talked about. One thing that I've seen fail many, many, many times on these air conditioning condensate systems is the collection pan itself. These are normally made of metal and they tend to rust through. And when that happens, the condensate will leak. And many times, because as I said before, these systems are not easily accessible, you won't know where the water's coming from. So it does require a high degree of inspection capability and understanding. Again, don't shortchange it, particularly if you're the guy who's actually doing it. Make sure you do a thorough job. Very important. I want to talk now just a moment or two about utilities, installation, reliability, and backups. All building structures typically are connected to the outside world unless you're truly off-grid. But these connections generally that put you in sort of in direct connection with the world are building utilities. They're the services that bring the building to life. They kind of make it inhabitable, comfortable, and useful. So never define building utilities as something that are just there and sort of won't affect anything, because quite honestly, without them, all you have is a shell. So looking to the installation here and the backups about electricity specifically, we never should become complacent about the electricity that runs in our building. We have some pretty good sized considerations here that we have to look at. First of all, how was the electric system installed? Now, I don't expect everybody here to be a building designer or even an electrician, but you need to understand whether something is going to work properly over time or not. So it does require a little bit of understanding as to whether a system is correctly installed or not. And the biggest issue is, quite honestly, what might have been modified over the years. People get into building electrical panels and out onto the floor, and they make all kinds of bad choices because they feel that they're pressured to do it. Be very careful of that. You can't necessarily stop the bad choices, but you can sort of continuously reinforce the need for good choices. We need to make sure that connections are not overheating, wire sizes are sufficient to carry the loads that are put through them. You can't carry 20 amps on a number 20 wire. That just doesn't work. But what you have to do, as I said, you're not going to be able to stop all the bad choices, but you can at least impress your people that no shortcuts should be taken when a system is expanded to either accommodate additional tenants or additional machinery or whatever it happens to be, and the consequent electric loads. The fact is, the world is powered by electricity. We think of it, as being just commonplace because today it's simple to install, it's relatively inexpensive, and if it's used properly, by the way, it's very safe. So why then do you think are approximately 12 people on average electrocuted in the United States every single day? Well, I believe it's because of complacency. Electricity is so common, again, ubiquitous, that we tend to take it for granted and we place our attention and focus on other things. And again, there's a whole psychology that revolves around complacency, and it's really very fascinating, but I don't have time to go into it. But as building managers and controllers, if you will, we can't become complacent about the electricity that runs through the building. The biggest considerations we have, of course, is how the electric system was installed, what might have been modified over the years. Now, we can't do a whole lot necessarily about the original electric system installation, other than verifying that the connections are made properly and they're not overheating and that wire sizes are sufficient to carry the loads that are running through them. And these can usually be verified with amp meters and with infrared testing to be able to make sure there's not overheating. We can, however, mandate that no shortcuts are going to be taken when the system gets expanded to accommodate additional tenants or, like I say, additional machinery and that sort of thing. You don't need to be an expert in any of the areas I've mentioned or will mention anywhere within this course, but you do need to know who is an expert that you can call on to perform the necessary inspections and that you can trust to do it properly and make the necessary corrections or repairs. Again, you don't have to be an expert yourself, but you have to know who the experts are. Now, there's another utility, and that is water and wastewater. Not only is a reliable supply of water necessary, but also having a reliable supply of wastewater or the ability to get rid of wastewater is critical to the functioning of any occupied building today, whether the occupancy is permanent or once in a while or just once. We all have become expectant on water coming out of the faucet once we turn the handle and the valve on. And not only having water come out, but water which is pure enough typically to drink, potable water. We all have an expectation that that water is going to be usable for the purposes that we intend it for, or mostly fit for human consumption. Today, unfortunately, that may actually be too great an expectation. More and more municipalities as well as private concerns, are having to perform extreme measures in order to filter and treat water to make it safe for people to drink. We've unfortunately polluted ourselves into a situation where not all of our water is safe. But even then, even after going through the treatment and that sort of thing, there are microbes which are very, very tiny, such as Giardia, that sometimes slip on through the system. And if people drink that water, my own wife had the situation with this, they become quite ill. Fortunately, most of these slips don't result in life-threatening conditions, but who knows? Someday they could. So having the infrastructure to remove wastewater from our building is at least as important as having a reliable and sanitary supply of fresh water fed into the building. Many municipalities today insist that the wastewater you return to them, not sewage water, talking wastewater, gray water, is actually cleaner than the fresh water they supplied to you in the first place. Now, you might say, well, that's not very reasonable, but unfortunately, they also have masters that they're reporting to. And those masters have said, this is what you're going to do, so you have to do it. Anyway, the wastewater has to be filtered, treated before going back to the municipality. Otherwise, you could be fined. And then talking to lighting for just a moment. This is the most obvious utility, although not called that typically. The building's lighting. And it's an area that has seen a lot of innovation over the years and major changes over the past few years. Now, again, I'm not going to get into all the lighting improvements which have been made. I wanted to mention the lighting to you and, things about intensity and color. They play a huge part in satisfying occupants and also producing a state of calm in everyone who is afforded this light. Bulbs or fixtures which have failed or maybe flickering. Nothing annoys me more than going into a building where they have flickering fluorescent lights. They're very annoying. And the fact is that it's so easy to repair or replace. And so if you want your tenants or your visitors to be happy most of the time, keep their lighting well maintained. And then of course we have other engineered building systems. I'm going to only briefly touch on this. This is kind of the catch-all for critical infrastructure, which is not categorized elsewhere. There are many building systems which could represent this category, but I'm just going to quickly talk about 3 of them. Stairs, escalators, elevators. Elevators, again, have their own unique requirements as far as the operating mechanism is concerned, but they do share common safety requirements. Adequate safety braking, passenger cabin ventilation, and controls which are obvious and easy. And of course, most importantly, these things should go to the top floor and become inoperable in the event of a fire. You don't want people in the elevator shafts during a fire, because an elevator shaft is a chimney. So if you have a fire at a lower level, the smoke and the flames are going to run right up the chimney and basically consume anything in it. And that could include the elevator car and you if you're in the elevator car. So again, these systems require inspection, correction to any areas which are problematic, and documentation. And then we also have building automation, and I've got here the talking about the Internet of Things. Now, computerized systems, they can assist or supplement our tasks. They can help make our activities generally more efficient as long as we don't rely too heavily on them. They can give us real-time operating data, or they can run the building while we're not there, not for an indefinite period. And we have the ability not only to monitor what's going on remotely, but we can also reprogram some of that stuff, even entire logic sequences remotely. And that's kind of a problem from one aspect, by the way. And we can change the total system operating characteristics. Not only, unfortunately, can we, who are authorized, to reprogram entire logic sequences, sometimes we have hackers who get into systems and they can reprogram systems too. That's why I say the Internet of Things. It's a good thing and it's a bad thing, double-edged sword. Anyway, going on to the summary, quite honestly at Vector Solutions, and this is true, I've been working with Vector Solutions for a little more than a year now, we're committed to providing this content and the knowledge that you need to run your business and your buildings and departments safely and efficiently. Emphasis on safely. This information that I presented today is intended to inform you of building areas which should be considered high priority because, again, of the high potential for injury and even loss of life. We do offer, as I said before, complete facilities maintenance and management training so that you can support whatever efforts you're looking for. And again, if you're looking to onboard new employees or take journeymen to the next level or just become more familiar with whatever the subject is, we have the topics to be able to help you get there. And one thing I just wanted to.
Hi, Bruce. Sorry to cut you off. I just want to be
okay.
respectful of everyone's time. Thank you so much for the presentation. Did you have something to add there?
Well, I was just going to add that right now we are in the midst of the novel coronavirus restrictions. And I just want to let everyone know that these particular restrictions are not caused by anything that anyone has done or not done from a building maintenance standpoint or anything like that, but we can improve conditions, and unfortunately we're going to have a new reality going forward from this point to maintain the a lot of the let's say non-microbial conditions within our buildings. So again, make sure that, and I didn't address this specifically, but make sure that you understand what those requirements are for sanitizing and disinfecting going forward, because that's going to become a new part of our lives from this point on. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, so much. Well, we really appreciate it. I found the information really helpful, and I hope all of you out there do as well. After the webcast, if you'd like to check out our new courses, we do have over 60 courses that we've added. They're actually complete with 3D animation, motion graphics, even some situational examples, you know, to give your learners a really heightened experience that, you know, kind of puts them on scene. So we're very, very proud of the courses. And if you visit the link there, you can see a full trailer. It touches on a lot of the courses Bruce mentioned. In fact, Bruce wrote many of the courses in this new library. And if you have questions for Bruce or for myself, here's some information you could take with you. And we thank you so much for joining us.